I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Those of you who watch TV or watch the Fox News Network or the Fox Business Network are well aware of David, and I think it's just interesting for us to point out he's got an intellectual background here at a think tank like the Manhattan Institute as well. So it makes perfect sense, I think, for us to have him here today moderating this panel or this discussion really with Chairman Pitt and Commissioner Atkins. So, David, I'll turn it over to you.
By the way, the Manhattan Institute was not even called the Manhattan Institute when I worked for it. It was called ICEPS, the International Center for Economic Policy Studies. So
truly,
that's how far back I go.
But before I turn over to David, I'm sorry, I forgot. Those of you who are seeking CLE credit, please turn in your evaluation forms and sign out when you're leaving. The CLE credit is still pending, but we do expect that to be approved, and we will process it all as if it's going to be. Thank you.
I want to thank the Manhattan, and Jim, I want to thank you for really pioneering research in this topic, because as anybody who covered the whole Occupy Wall Street movement from the beginning realized that one of the key components of that whole organization and the whole thrust of that movement was to somehow virally enter into the corporate governance process, and to a certain extent they have done so. They've succeeded at that, but to the extent that some of their true motives have been uncovered by Jim, that has been an extraordinary effort. So thanks to Jim, thanks to the Manhattan Institute for doing this research, which I think is pretty important. By the way, for those who want to keep updated on the news, if you haven't heard, and this is one reason I was late coming here, the ambassador to Libya was killed. There were at least 2 other people killed. Originally, it was thought that they were Marines. It's now the Pentagon is throwing a little cold water on that. But Ambassador Chris Stevens, who really was very personally involved in getting rid of Gaddafi, and at least involved in putting some of the people who probably killed him in power in Libya. The latest word is that he was strangled to death. So it's an awful situation, and it is apparently spreading to other embassies in North Africa and the Middle East. So that's the latest on that. Back to our issue at hand. In addition to other things I did at the Journal, I edited for 12 years something called the Manager's Journal, which was a weekly column on management, and we dealt a lot with corporate governance issues, and ironically, some of the things that concerned a free market editorial page like the Wall Street Journal do interest the people in the Occupy movement, and some of the people who may be considered at odds with our own interests, but issues of buddy boards, that is, a CEO putting his friends on board in order to boost his independence, if not his salary. The questions of salaries in particular. Even Robert Bartley, by the way, the late great editor of the Wall Street Journal, who was my mentor from the time I started in '83 there, was concerned about corporate pay. I mean, he thought that the salary increases of the '80s were going to lead, not necessarily because he wanted any government intervention in salaries, but because he thought that the extraordinary increase in corporate salaries would lead to a backlash similar to that which we are seeing now and we have seen in the past 5 years. So even Bob Bartley thought that some of the issues that concern the people involved in these movements were the issues. It's just what concerned him was that the reaction, they would use those relatively decent causes to lure in people for their own personal causes, which were much more motivated by union interests, et cetera. It's a very tricky business dealing with these issues, and our two guests here are perfectly suited to do that. I know both of them from having interviewed them on various shows that I've done at Fox News and Fox Business, and they are both absolutely the right people to talk about these issues to. Paul Atkins, he is now Chief Executive Officer of Potomac Global Partners. He is to my immediate left. He was served as a commissioner on the SEC from July 2002 to August 2008. He was also on the TARP panel. I believe you worked with Elizabeth Warren, right?
That's right.
So you didn't build that, did you?
No.
No.
Right.
But he was on the TARP panel from 2009 to 2010. He began his career as a lawyer with Davis Polk, but again, he's maintained his interest in SEC affairs from the time he began to current times. Harvey Pitt, who is on the end of the table there, is chief executive of the global business consulting firm Kalorama Partners. He, of course, served as the 26th chairman of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission from 2001 until 2003. He is also, by the way, a founding trustee and the first president of the SEC Historical Society. So, again, the whole history of the SEC, what it was meant to be and what it has become, is of great interest to him. And as to that latter part, what the SEC has become, Harvey has said some pretty, I would say, strong, at the very least, comments about what the SEC has become. He's described it at various times as a completely dysfunctional organization currently, and asked the provocative question, do we really want a dysfunctional agency to determine issues governing free speech, particularly as it concerns corporate governance? These are issues that I want to get into today, too. Partly because they're so controversial, coming from a former head of the SEC, but also because they do deal with a part of the discussion, which is the question of free speech, insofar as the Supreme Court has deemed it free speech expression, and the interests of those who want to curtail what the Supreme Court has recognized as free speech and use the SEC as a tool to do that. I'd like to begin by asking Harvey a question that's not directly related, but kind of is a fear in the back of a lot of people's minds as to what might be going on here. Since this administration has used other regulatory agencies like the EPA, for example, to pursue its own political and social agendas, recognizing that the SEC is supposed to be completely independent, and they do have no more than 3 partisan members appointed at any one particular time. But is it conceivable that in a second Obama presidency, we may see the SEC used as some kind of vehicle to pursue the social agendas that we saw outlined by the movement, the Occupy movements that we've seen over the past year?
Absolutely. I think it's very much a concern, and it sort of raises a fundamental issue, which is what is the purpose of the SEC? And in listening to the panel before us, I think the Manhattan Institute deserves a great deal of credit for putting this program together. I found it very instructive, not just to read the Proxy Monitor report, but to listen to the panelists, who I thought had very compelling observations to make. My concern here is that we've gotten away from what the fundamental purposes are of a lot of the vehicles that are now being twisted for other purposes. Shareholder democracy and shareholder activism are great if you keep in mind that the function of corporations is to provide an economic benefit to their shareholders. So when you ask corporations to start getting into all sorts of social, political, and other agenda items, you've basically tried to divert the system away from what it's supposed to achieve. But The short answer, David, I think is in a second Obama term, I think you will definitely see an effort to mobilize the SEC for more politically oriented purposes, and it's really the function of all of the commissioners, whether they be Democrats or Republicans, to resist that kind of effort. That's why the agency is comprised of bipartisan membership and so on. I not only had to deal with Democrats, I had to deal with brilliant Republicans as well. And fortunately, I had Paul there to keep my excesses in check. So I think you run a real risk of what we may see in a second Obama term.
Well, Paul, let me ask you, first of all, if you agree with Harvey that this is a danger if things continue as they are, and if you agree with him, aren't there enough checks and balances in the composition of the SEC, the way it's been set up, to avoid partisanship so that these political and social agendas cannot be inserted by political operatives?
Well, I think it's a good question, and I agree with Harvey in the main. I think that already, unfortunately, the current SEC is very politicized. If you look what's gone on over the past 3 years, the proxy access issue was just one of them, where they have tons of things on their plate to do because of DoddFrank and whatnot. But the first thing out of the box, even before the ink was dried on DoddFrank, was pushing this issue, which of course was ultimately thrown out by the D.C. Circuit because they did such a terrible job in studying the costs and benefits of it. But basically, the SEC was empowered by Congress to do something like this, but it was just left up to their discretion. So rather than doing anything else, they first concentrated on that. Before that, there was global warming disclosure that the chairman pushed in conjunction with the Copenhagen Global Warming Conference back in 2009. And then unfortunately, the enforcement actions like the Goldman Sachs case where there were only 2 affected investors, and they were both big institutions which could have definitely prosecuted any grievances they had on their own. But the SEC, in a very, again, a politically motivated action, the way it was announced sort of within at 10:30 in the morning during trading hours, which was highly unusual, the way there was no real back and forth with the company in the negotiations, and was suddenly sprung on them, and it was just happened to be done right before a hearing regarding what was to become Dodd-Frank. That was a big disappointment. And then there was another issue. There are a whole list of them, but I'll just pick another one that goes back to the proxy access, where in the Bank of America Merrill Lynch case over the disclosure of the acquisition, that the chairman's office intervened in the enforcement action and tried to get a proxy access provision inserted into the settlement order. The enforcement staff apparently was upset about that, as of course was the respondent, and they refused to go along, and it was finally, the chairman's office finally receded. But those actions, I think, along with a myriad others in connection with Dodd-Frank, point to an agency that has become much more politicized under this administration. And like Harvey, I fear that it would just continue to be so if there is a second term.
Well, Harvey, return on investment is, if indeed that is the heart of capitalism, which I think it is, return on personal investment, whether it's your own time and effort or whether it's cash, and if that is the chief responsibility of the SEC to make sure that corporations are adhering to their prime directive, which is return on investment, how can these other directives supersede that prime directive, the directives on global warming or political objectives?
Well, I think part of the problem is that the SEC is being buffeted by a lot of external pressures. And I think, unfortunately, it is having to accommodate to them. And when I say that, I mean you've got the Dodd-Frank Act, which in my view, is a classic example of why legislation is too important to be left to the United States Congress. You know, if you think back about it, it took God a single tablet of 10 commandments to prescribe conduct for the entire human race. And it took the United States Congress 2,313 pages to come up with a partial list of requirements for the financial services industry. The burden that was put on the SEC was incredible. There's no way they could satisfy it. The bill became sort of, depending on your preference for analogies, either the kitchen sink or a garbage pail. But it has all sorts of ludicrous things thrown into it that have nothing to do with the essential mandate of the agency. And even where it did try to deal with some very important issues, like the swaps and derivatives markets, it did it in the most awkward way. It set up silly time deadlines that couldn't possibly be met, and effectively sets up the regulators, the SEC and the CFTC, for failure. So that's a set of pressures. There are other pressures that are being imposed on the SEC, and the result has been it's been diverted. Instead of having a straight-ahead look at what it ought to be doing, the SEC is being required to deal with a whole variety of things. And I take, for example, the whole say-on-pay issue as a classic example. We didn't need legislation on say-on-pay.
Describe what say-on-pay is, Harvey.
Pardon?
Describe what say-on-pay is.
Yeah, the question is whether shareholders should have some ability to record their reactions to the pay that is being offered to senior corporate executives. And Congress effectively now requires that at least triennially corporations are required to have a non-binding vote. And although Congress specifically provided, by the way, that there could be no court action arising out of a vote, needless to say, almost immediately after the provision went into effect, there were 6 lawsuits filed seeking to enforce various aspects of these provisions. All of this is just an incredible diversion. The same thing with proxy access. Many people have wondered about getting access to nominating directors for corporations. And the SEC has struggled with this. I'm pleased to say it didn't start struggling with it until after I left the agency. But it's been struggling with this, and every proposal the SEC has put out has been terribly flawed. And finally, DoddFrank gave it discretionary authority to pass a rule on proxy access. It did, and then it wound up losing the case in the D.C. Circuit, where the SEC has lost about 6 straight rulemaking cases because it cannot, as Paul alluded to earlier, come up with a cost-benefit analysis. I think the problem there is its cost-benefit analyses are done by lawyers instead of by economists, and that's a fundamental problem with a cost-benefit analysis. It's an economic study. It's not a legal argumentation the way it's been used at the SEC. So I think there are all of these diversions, pressures, and obligations imposed on the agency. And I think sum total of this is to take an agency that has a critical and fundamental mission in our society, namely dealing with capitalism and making sure it flourishes, and instead has gotten the SEC involved in all sorts of things, even when it hasn't done some of the things that Paul has mentioned. It's gotten the SEC involved in things and issues that really aren't crucial. We have serious problems with our capital markets, and the SEC is having a hard time even looking at those issues, much less resolving them.
Paul, we just heard Harvey say that the chief goal of the SEC is to make sure that capitalism flourishes. I wonder if you think the people in this administration believe that that is the SEC's primary goal.
Well, that's a good question. I wonder what their real view of the marketplace is in general, especially when you look at DoddFrank and some of these, as Harvey was alluding to, these extraneous provisions that are being pushed through, like, for example, the Volcker Rule, which, regardless of what the intentions are, as you can see, I mean, with the way the 5 different regulatory agencies have tried to struggle with it, they can't really figure out how to make it work and how to get the definitions right without tanking, some of the essential services of the banking industry, and then it's created a lot of international angst as well, with a lot of foreign governments intervening in the comment period. So I think that's a good question, and I think what really is very sad to me is that these issues with respect to the financial markets and the SEC really should not be political. And that is why I think the strength used to be at the SEC was that, it was, as you alluded to at the beginning, there are no more than 3 members can be of the same political party as the president. And so that sets up a 3-2 issue. And for the most part, historically, there have been, with some exceptions, a consensus that's built up. I remember when I used to work for Richard Breeden, he used to say that the Republic has never fallen because the SEC has not been able to pass a particular rule, and he was not going to really push something through by 3-2. So that was, his philosophy there. And so for the longest time, I think these arguments were, or the debates were not partisan. Unfortunately, sort of in conjunction when Harvey came in, especially as chairman, in the wake of September 11th, 2001, it was very, the debate swung, especially with respect to Enron and WorldCom and whatnot, to corporate responsibility. And so that became, especially with the 2002 election, very much of where both sides were looking for a rematch. They couldn't really talk about national defense issues. And so the points of contention turned up to be SEC related. And so I think that was very unfortunate for those folks to push it. And you're seeing the same thing now play out with the whole issue of political spending and by corporations, and that was discussed a little bit in the first panel. I thought they did an excellent job over, in discussing the current situation. And if you look at this issue, it's really a microcosm, because as they were discussing, it comes out of Citizens United and Speech Now cases. So what exactly is corporate speech? And so that has gotten a particular part of the electorate and others very agitated, and the administration as well, where the president, in an amazing scene at the State of the Union address, if you remember, where he basically dressed down the Supreme Court justices sitting in front of him. So, this issue definitely animates some, and so now it's come into this realm, and so we've seen a number of these proposals come up. They haven't gotten anywhere close to a majority, and in fact this year, as has been pointed out in this report, the support has fallen, yet it has generated a lot of discussion and a lot of push by particular activists, and I'm sure that it's going to be going on in the future. But it just doesn't, as was pointed out, doesn't affect corporate giving to political candidates, because that's all disclosed by law, and in fact they aren't really that active in it. But this is part of a bigger agenda to affect how corporations influence other processes like regulation and tax and things like that through government affairs efforts and public affairs, and to try to pressure them on groups to which they give money, for example, if it's a trade association, or as we saw recently with the American Legislative Exchange Council, which I like to say is, I don't know if they take this well or not, but it's kind of a nerdy group. They usually focus on tax policy and regulatory policy. They're right of center, and they help states with model acts. Well, in the wake of the Trayvon Martin shooting, some groups focused on them and on the corporate donors to ALEC because of the stand your ground laws and the voter ID laws that ALEC had also been helping various states on. And so then was ascribed to them, it's a racist organization and things like that, and that these groups put pressure on I think McDonald's and Wendy's and Coke and Pepsi, big retail consumer products-oriented companies that were very uncomfortable with this suddenly unwanted or unexpected public attention, and so they basically dropped their funding of ALEC. So
not all of them, I should mention, but a number of them did.
A number of them did, and so so I think that's part of the agenda on a number of these groups. And in fact, they're very upfront about it. If you look at Media Matters was mentioned earlier, and one of their strategic documents leaked, and basically they lay it right out that the whole shareholder activism issue is a way to put pressure on boards. And Saul Alinsky, in his famous Rules for Radical book that he put out in the 70s, has a whole chapter on what he called tactic proxy. And so he, with Eastman Kodak and other companies, and we see where they are today, but anyway, they that's where these shareholder activists first started going down this route for proxy activism, and the SEC unfortunately has aided and abetted that over time.
All right, this is pretty big stuff. Harvey, if in fact the SEC has changed over the past few years its primary directive from creating an environment in which capitalism flourishes to creating an environment in which capitalism is more fair, according to the political definitions of that word, it would seem that the SEC has become somewhat of a rogue organization, and the question then is, how do you get back to the primary directive? How do you get the SEC back to its original objective of creating an environment in which capitalism flourishes from its current, more political agenda?
Well, I think there are a number of steps that can be taken, and I just want to make it very clear. I have great affection for the SEC, and I'm a big supporter of the SEC, even when it undertakes actions with which I disagree. I do want to point out, and Paul and I lived through Sarbanes-Oxley, and we passed every single rule 5-0 that came up out of Sarbanes-Oxley. We were directed to adopt those rules. I think it's fair to say that there were a number of them that I didn't like. I'm positive there were a number Paul didn't like, and so on, but we got there. So in a sense, getting the SEC's focus back requires a couple of things. At the end of the day, it requires trying to reach a consensus on where it's going to devote its energies and what it is going to treat as its primary obligations. Unfortunately, no matter how many hours in a day you work, and I've tried this, I've tried working 24, even 25 hours flying back from the West Coast and so on. At least I build that way to my clients, but sorry, that slipped out. But one of the things you need to do is come up with your agenda, come up with your approach, and then try to reach a consensus on what is going to promote the interests both of capitalism and of shareholders. They're synonymous. Now, there can be differences, and when there are differences, the crucial goal is to try and reach a compromise. That's why the SEC is not a single administratorship. Nobody who has ever been chairman of the SEC, I'm positive of this, has ever failed to think to himself or herself, it really would be great if there were not 4 other commissioners. I mean, I could really accomplish a lot if it were just me. But that's not the way the statute reads. And so the SEC is like a microcosm of corporate boards. People have to reach agreement. The problem is that in regulating corporate America, the SEC doesn't look at what it imposes on corporate America, or even look at what corporate America needs to do to function at its most efficient and successful level. And that requires 5 people working together, disagreeing for sure, and then resolving those disagreements, compromising, finding ways to move the agency forward. When the agency keeps voting 3-2, or when it fails to vote because it can't even put something out to solicit public comments on it, that's the sign that the agency has become dysfunctional, and that's why I use that term. There's no place for that. Somebody has to basically come up with a working methodology, and people cannot dig their heels in, no matter how determined they are to pursue principles and the like. You get if you have a good agency, you have very strong-willed people on that agency. And every commissioner has only a single vote, which means even though one person is chairman, they're all equal. Everybody's vote is important. I just don't see that functioning right now. And I think that we need to get back to starting with what are the issues we're going to tackle, in what order, how are we going to reach a consensus that achieves the legitimate purposes, not which pursues particular agenda items. That, to me, has to be the starting point.
Okay. I'm going to ask the same question to Paul, and then I think we have some time for questions from the audience. Paul, how do you regulate the regulators at the SEC?
Yeah, well, a few points. I think, Harvey is right. I think the real problem here is the leadership of the SEC right now, and I think what you were alluding to was the money market mutual fund issue, where here you have a chairman who was pushing a policy, and I think the 3 commissioners who basically stood up to her and said no should really be commended, because they grounded their opposition in first of all, the lack of any kind of study or any kind of analysis that passes muster from the chairman's office, and including, I'll say here, from just unbelievable things that are being put out by the Fed and the Treasury, which make completely no sense. And,
for example?
Well, for example, there was an article by Bill Dudley, who's the president of the New York Fed, which has so many just falsities in it that don't stand up to scrutiny. Was pretty incredible. And if that's the way our monetary policy
Don't hold
is
back,
done.
Paul.
No, exactly. I think it's really amazing. But I'll answer those points here in due time, one by one. But but that has infected what the current chairman, who's on the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which was founded by DoddFrank. But that is informing, I guess, her worldview and what she's pushing. So I really commend the other commissioners for demanding actually a much more studied approach that's grounded in data, which is, I think, what is so great about, going back to this issue here, what the Manhattan Institute has done by really looking at the data and seeing, what shareholders have proposed and how it's going. But overall, going back to our earlier point about, what is the view, or what should be the view of the financial markets, I think, unfortunately, DoddFrank and the current administration is pushing a view of what I like to call stability über alles. So that means that what they're trying to do is make the financial markets stable, which is a laudable goal, I guess. But what they have to realize is that inherently markets are unstable, and because people themselves are unstable, they're subject to all sorts of emotions, as we all know, fear and greed and what have you, that influence their buying decisions. And that's why the SEC needs to rise above all that and come up with a view of the marketplace and how the regulations should work that really answer the needs of all investors and not just those of a few. And especially in this environment where, again, the Fed has pushed rates to basically zero, and it has really, I think, a pernicious effect on ordinary investors who are out there seeking return, watching, especially if they're on fixed income, seeing their bank accounts return next to nothing per month. And so they're susceptible to all sorts of fraud and abuse by snake oil salesmen and things like that. And so that's where the SEC needs to be especially actively involved right now in enforcement to make sure that these sorts of bad eggs are not robbing investors blind. And instead, they're off on political agendas trying to deal with shareholder access, or, as I mentioned, global warming, or some of the other issues that, as was said, somebody with $2,000 worth can get a public soapbox to advance his parochial interests.
Okay, I don't mean to be pessimistic, but it's unlikely that a dysfunctional Congress is going to change a dysfunctional agency. Right. Wouldn't you both agree?
Well said.
All right. Questions? Yes, sir. Here comes, if you could just hold off a second, there's your mic.
Thank you. Chris Giancarlo, GFI Group. Just in time to solve the problem of a lack of cost-benefit analysis, I note that Better Markets, a liberal interest group focused on market structure, is putting out a study today on the financial crisis and calculating trillions of dollars of lost wealth, lost GDP, and other factors, which no doubt will work its way into some cost-benefit analysis rulemaking to justify overreaching regulation in order to, as Paul said, achieve this riskless, stable environment. But my question is, at what point do regulators actually have to take ownership of a GDP growth at 1.7%, a sluggish economy, capital markets in which investors cannot either hedge risk or raise capital to make investment? And at some point, the trade-off between a riskless economy and no growth is got to inure back to those regulators, ultimately those policymakers on Capitol Hill and the administration. Right. For their role in all of this.
I think that reaches to Paul's point that if people lose money, there's something wrong with the system. And therefore the system has to change, and the SEC is the one to change it. Right, Paul?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I'll look with interest at this study that you're alluding to. But I mean, clearly there were, there was lots of money that disappeared in the wake of the financial crisis. But how much of that was real? How much was illusory in a bubble, and especially a bubble created by government policy of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the whole housing issue, where I was on the TARP oversight panel, so we dealt with some of those issues. But anyway, I think it's a
Harvey?
Sorry.
Well, the one concern I have, and I agree with Paul, that there's an effort, in effect, to make the entire system comparable to a banking system, safety and soundness and so on. The problem is, even accepting the criticism of that, we haven't achieved it. If you look at our capital markets right now, we've seen glitch after glitch after glitch caused by technology, and I'm a big proponent of improved technology. We've had Facebook, we've had JP Morgan, we had the flash crash, we have Knight Securities, And people
MF
are
Global,
looking,
don't forget MF Global.
Yes, and people are looking at our markets now and saying, these markets aren't stable, they're not fair. So as bad as it is for everybody to try and spend all of their time creating stability, at least we ought to succeed, even if we have the wrong objective. We not only have the wrong objective, we're not achieving it. So I'm very concerned. That's where our attention needs to be. We need to find a way to make our markets function more effectively, because that's the way corporations are able to finance their growth and provide new jobs and the like. And if you can't use this system the way it was intended to be used, we're going to lose more jobs than we're already losing, and we're going to create even more problems than we already have.
Well, just to throw one more thing in, I think Harvey talked about this a little bit before, but when you look at DoddFrank and how, it's 2,319 pages and, 12 titles or whatever, that most of which were passed without any really any substantive hearings. A lot of things are written, behind closed doors, the lobbyists sticking things here and there, and, without any real public vetting. And so now the regulators are having to deal with it. And so basically we're maybe a quarter or a third of the way through the rules that need to be, or that Congress has commanded the various agencies to adopt. And so there's this huge amount of uncertainty out there hanging over financial institutions, hanging over investors and whatnot, not just here but abroad, because this is, of course, replicated in Europe, which they have their problems. And if you think Dodd-Frank is bad, at least there are four corners to it. What's going on in Europe is just a myriad of all sorts of rules that the European Commission is looking at in the Parliament and whatnot coming out with, and that has an effect.
Well, and now you have regulatory agencies that are answerable to nobody. I'm thinking of your old boss's creation, that's under the auspices of the Federal Reserve Board, a $400 million agency that's supposed to check into consumer fraud and financial services industries, that not only is not answerable to Congress, but that comes up with its own budget of $400 billion. It's even as answerable to itself for its own salary. So there are dangerous trends even outside of the SEC with regard to regulation of our financial markets. Anybody else? Gentlemen, I think we should leave it at that. It's 11 o'clock. Thank you very much. Paul Atkins, Harvey Pitt.
Good stuff. I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.